Welcome to the April 2017 update for the Microsoft Australian OEM team. In this update, we'll be focusing on some of the new capabilities in Windows Server 2016 that are shared technologies with Windows 10. Now, we'll actually be breaking this down into a two-part session. So for April, we'll focus on some of the underlying technologies and how you can have them coexist. But once we move into the May recording, what we'll do with that one is we'll actually focus on how they work together. So what are some of the things that are implemented on the client side that have got direct integration and start adding to the capabilities when we are connected to Server 2016. So the focus for today will be as per usual, we'll do a quick recap of the Server 2016 editions and which one you would sell where. And then we'll jump into just an overview of the Better Together story. Then we'll move into the Hyper-V, Windows Containers, Device Guard, and Credential Guard. In terms of in some cases it'll be, it's effectively the same technology in both. But in other cases we'll do a bit more of a compare and contrast. Starting off with Server 2016 editions. So as we take a look at this, what you'll see here is we've got Essentials Edition that is, it's been in market for a while now, since I think basically the 2011 timeframe. So what we've got now is we've still got the 25 users and 50 devices, and it's still got the usual implementation restriction. So it needs to be the root of the domain, etc. It needs to be the first domain controller. It needs to contain the FSMO roles, etc. For those of you familiar with the AD side, now you can install it on a physical machine or in a VM. And remember with Essentials is that the CALs are included, but if you need more than 25 users, Essentials can't scale above that. Now, once we jump across to Standard and Data Center, there are a lot of common capabilities between them. But once we start looking at Data Center over Standard, some of the additional things we get in there are unlimited virtual machines rather than just 2 virtual machines. We get unlimited Hyper-V containers versus 2 Hyper-V containers. And there are also a whole host of new capabilities added in Server 2016 that are part of Data Center. So things like the storage replica capabilities and storage spaces direct, which we covered last month. There's the new networking stack, so that centralized networking controller, as well as some of their shielded VM and host guardian service capabilities. And we'll actually talk about some of those as we go through today. So taking another look here at the differences between the different editions. So really just, the overview here is for people who need either some of those advanced capabilities or are looking at highly virtualized environments, then Server 2016 Data Center is really going to be the appropriate choice for them. Now, Server 2016, for people who don't really have a large virtualization requirement, they're happy running, 2 VMs or stacking a couple of copies, they can do that. Now, with both of these, they are still CAL based in terms of per user licensing or per device licensing. And then for Essentials, as mentioned, it's limited to 25 users and 50 devices. And for people who are who may have been on Foundation Edition in the past and are looking to upgrade to something different with a bit more capability, then Essentials might fit the bill there for them. And then I won't go through the other options. These aren't ones that we sold directly through the OEM channel, but just highlighting that there are various editions of Server 2016 available. Moving on now to the Better Together story. So you've probably heard various takes on the Better Together story from Microsoft over time. And again, with Server 2016 and Windows 10, it's really worth talking about some of the benefits that combining these two provides. So let's take a look at some of these. So first up, it's a common infrastructure that helps to protect the clients and the servers against attacks and meet compliance requirements. Now, this will become more apparent as we go through today's content, and we'll also go into a little bit more detail on the next slide. Now, improved user productivity with streamlined secure access to data and apps, a consistent development platform. So if you've got, if you are working with an organization that's doing custom development, etc., knowing that they can go through and start running containers, etc., on their Windows 10 clients as well as on their servers, for example. And then finally, a common set of skills for the IT people. So one of the things here that even for me was a big realization was now that we've got the client and the server UIs in sync again, just how much better it is having the the server UI in Windows Server 2016 being pretty much identical or close to identical to Windows 10. So even just that in terms of the way you work, the way you get used to especially if you're using capabilities like Snap on a quad HD display or something like that, where you can just start snapping things into each corner quite easily. So it really starts bringing even I'd say it makes management more productive because of just the way you can work with those windows. Now drilling into this, now this is a screenshot from a PDF that's available on Microsoft.com. So if you just do a search for Windows Server and Windows 10 Better Together PDF, it should give you a link to this one pretty quickly. Now this is like some of the information that we are going out to partners and to customers with, just highlighting some of the capabilities. Now I won't go through them in too much detail here, but if we take a look here, this starts breaking down some of those categories we saw on that last screens. But in this case, it starts talking about some of those specific technologies, so things like credential guard, device guard, and we'll keep going through and talk about more of these as we go through today. But let's start off with a conversation around Hyper-V. Now, some of the capabilities that have been in Hyper-V since 2012 and 2012 R2. But as we jump into 2016, there's a whole host of new capabilities that have been added in. So that's quite an astounding change. But if we start taking a look at some of these, quite a few of these were in Windows 10 before they became available in Windows Server 2016. So some examples of that include things, and excuse me while I'll just move the mouse onto that screen. Examples of this are things like the virtual TPM support, the shielded VM support, we'll talk about those shortly, key storage for Gen 1 VMs, some of the other things that we've got in the new version. We've got nested virtualization, so running VMs within VMs is supported. So as you can see, as I go through this list, there are quite a few of the capabilities that were already available on the desktop. Now, there are a lot of features that are listed here that aren't available on the Windows 10 side because it's really designed to be standalone. It's not designed to be part of a cluster, for example, or part of some other type of scale up or scale out type solution. But as you can see, though, if you're sort of looking through this list and you are familiar with Hyper-V, there are a lot of capabilities in Hyper-V on Windows 10 that we can basically build VMs, test them, and then move them over to Server 2016 very, very easily. So let's talk about some of the enhancements now that have occurred over on the server side. So some of these do start picking up on the client side as well, but we'll focus on server for now. So challenges protecting virtual machines. Well, if someone gets physical access to the machine where the virtual machines are actually stored, and that storage isn't encrypted, it means that people can take those virtual drives. And this is really, regardless of the operating system, regardless of the virtualization solution. So how can we start making it easier so that even if someone does have access to the virtual machines themselves, the files, that they still don't have the rights to actually go through and open those. So we can use a combination of technologies here, and the first one is shielded virtual machines. With shielded virtual machines, effectively, we can have them running on the VM, but even the local admin of that server can't go through and see what's happening with them. So effectively, it means that what's yours is yours, and what's theirs is not. And what's yours is not theirs either. So in this case, it talks about that we can also use BitLocker to encrypt the disk and state of the virtual machines. So if someone does get access to the physical storage and copies the drives across, well, the drives are encrypted with BitLocker. So unless they also happen to have the BitLocker recovery key, they're not really going to be able to do anything with that. Now, next up, we've got the Host Guardian service. So this is where we can start setting up a fabric on our network where we can actually go through and make sure that when VMs are starting, if they're expecting to start in a secure environment, that they're actually being validated appropriately and before they're actually allowed to run. And then finally, a lot of these capabilities are being delivered now with the Generation 2 virtual machines. So things like now we can add in virtual TPMs. So this is something that I mentioned. You've got support for on the Windows 10 side as well. Now let's take a look here. I'll just build this table out so you can see. But effectively what we're seeing here is that once we start implementing some of these capabilities, we've got the ability to really start locking down who has access to the different pieces on the network. So if someone just needs access to the virtual machine, let's just give them that access rather than having them to have much broader access overall. Now, the next few slides will just focus on shielded virtual machines a little bit more before we move on. And the shielded VMs, they work with that host guardian service. So what you can see here is we've got this new guest VM that's starting up, and as it starts up, it has to ask, can I get some keys? So it has to go out to that key protection service to actually validate that it can get keys. So what happens here is, first of all, that key protection service has to know that the request is coming from a Hyper-V host that's a trusted host. So it has to know the physical machine, it has to trust the Hyper-V instance, and we need to have a compliant configuration. So we need to actually check that the device appears to be running in it, or the VM appears to be running in a healthy state. Now, once that healthy state is confirmed, it means we can actually say, yes, you are now allowed to start inside of this trusted network fabric. Now, moving on to Windows containers. So Windows containers were supported on Windows 10 before Windows 2016 was released. So while you could still test some of this stuff out in preview, technically Windows 10 did have this as a release capability first. Now, just some of the important things I want to call out here before we get into the next section is here you can see that with Windows 10 Pro and Enterprise is that that we can't run a Windows Server container because we can only run a Windows Server container on top of Windows Server. So if you take a look in that Windows Server container column, you'll see that we can run Server Core and Nano Server on top of Server 2016 with the full desktop experience. We can also run Server Core and Nano Server on top of Server 2016 Core. We can run Nano Server on Nano. So basically what we're saying is that we have to have a support for what that container actually requires. So as we move down that list, you'll see that their options become more restricted. Now, once we move across to the Hyper-V container story, what you can see here is that we can run Server Core and Nano Server across all of these, because once we start working with Hyper-V containers, we're actually doing we're basically providing more of that underlying platform for the containers to run on top of, and that will make a bit more sense after we go through the following slides. So if we think about the way we've traditionally worked with virtual machines and we work with hardware virtualization, even though it's highly efficient, we can do a lot of server consolidation, there is still a lot of scope where, if we take a look, we've got multiple instances of the operating system, we've got multiple virtual machines being emulated, so there's lots of memory, etc., lots of storage that's being utilized repeatedly for the same things across these virtual machines. So it means that we kind of do hit a limit in terms of scalability. So if we're working in a memory constrained system, this might be something where we could hit those limits quite quickly. Whereas when we take a look at containers, the way that it works here is we actually do operating system virtualization with containers. So we actually just run these applications up on top of a lighter weight kernel. Now, as we start running these additional containers on top of that container, so on top of that kernel, it means they're actually leveraging that shared kernel memory space. So we end up being able to get much greater density. But there's a downside to this approach, and for some customers, the idea of running with a shared kernel isn't really something that meets their security requirements. So what Microsoft introduced with Server 2016 was, an equivalent to Windows Server to these containers we see here, called Windows Server containers. So effectively, we've got the multiple containers running on top of a single kernel. Now, this is, a nice, fast way of doing things. It's easy to spin things up, and we can get great density. But again, it's a shared kernel. What we can start doing here is we can start using Hyper-V containers. So with Windows Server containers, it's available on Windows Server, but with Hyper-V containers, they're available on Windows Server as well as Windows 10. So what we can see here is that each of those, even though they're running on top of Hyper-V, they do each have their own smaller kernel, which means that it's not a full-blown instance of the operating system, so we can still get greater density than we could normally get through virtual machines, but it means that we do get the security benefits of having the isolated kernel between each of those containers. Now let's take a look at how like a Windows 10 user might be able to work inside this environment alongside the Windows Server environments. So the developers, more than likely they're running, they're going to be running Windows 10 on their laptops. They need to test things out. They might be running tools like Visual Studio. And what they can do here is once they're satisfied that the containers are working as expected, they can push those containers into the central repository. Now, an important part of the container conversation here is that, the container, regardless of whether you're going to be running the container on top of Hyper-V containers or Windows containers, effectively you don't need to plan for that. It's a matter of that's a deployment time decision. So you can just do Hyper-V containers on your local machine and then push it into this central repository, and then that's really something that based on the way the organization works or the way the app works will determine whether they want it in a standalone container or in a Hyper-V container. So let's move on now and talk about some of the security capabilities, starting with Device Guard. So Device Guard was originally introduced with Windows 10, but now it's also part of Windows Server 2016. And what it provides is hardware-rooted app control. So basically, we're leveraging the hardware capabilities itself to provide additional application protection. So we can lock the OS down just to run protected apps. And this is a concept that in a lot of ways shares, brings some ideas over from the mobile world. So things like untrusted apps and executables, so things like malware aren't able to run. And we've got a signed policy which makes sure that we've got a secure configuration so it's free from tampering. And it also means that we've got protection at the kernel level and with drivers from zero-day vulnerabilities. So there are some pieces that you need to have in place for this to work. So just importantly to note here is on the Windows 10 side, this isn't something that you get with Windows 10 Pro. You will need to do a step up to the Windows 10 Enterprise Edition, for example, if you need this. But that's available through the CSP platform, so that's something that you can obtain for your customers quite easily if they want to take that subscription. But it also does require these hardware capabilities as well. Now, as we get into Device Guard, again, talking about getting apps into this circle of trust, so we can add universal apps, we can run our traditional Win32/desktop and server apps, and trusted apps can be created by third parties, by in-house organizations, and Microsoft provides their own signing service so that you can just use the Windows Store for Business to go through and actually start signing your own apps if you are a custom app builder. Now, apps and policies must be signed, and then we don't need any additional modification to the code itself. So as I said, the signing service policies are available to enterprises for their internal line of business apps up on the Windows Store for Business. If we just take a look at a few diagrams around how this works, so here where we talk about VBS, we're talking about virtualization-based security. What we've got here is that effectively Device Guard sits in here and it makes sure that it's only, once we put these policies in place, it's only what we allow to run that will actually work. So when it comes to ensuring the integrity of Windows, some of the pieces that we need here, we need to make sure that we've got secure boot enabled. So obviously we can't use good old BIOS to boot. We need to use UEFI because it's got additional security capabilities in place. Then we've got the, what then happens is that we've got the kernel mode integrity, code integrity piece that kicks in, then user mode integrity, and we can also then layer app locker on top of that. So for people who are really looking at how do we lock these devices down, how do we prevent things like malware, it might be spyware, it might be ransomware, from infecting our devices. So the good news is that the technologies are out there. It's really a matter of going through and having the right version of Windows and actually implementing them. Now continuing on from the Device Guard story, we've got Credential Guard. Now, one of the big things with Credential Guard is that it's all around, one of the big things it's targeting here is, preventing past the hash attacks, which used to be hypothetical types of attacks in a network, and basically they are now, very well-known attack vectors inside a lot of organizations. So there are tools like Mimikatz that are available to steal user credentials, and effectively what happens here is once the attacker gets one person's credentials, they start getting the ability to start moving across the network. So how can we visualize that? So here's a good way we can see it. So let's say a single IT pro's computer is compromised. Well, all of a sudden, once that IT Pro's access token is stolen, they can then basically start looking for other things on the network and start looking for additional tokens. And then over time, this will just keep expanding and expanding to the point where what ends up happening is, generally within a short time period, someone has got admin levels credentials for the entire organization. So how do we address this? Well, this is where we can take a look at Credential Guard. So with Credential Guard, it's got the ability to go through, and you can see here it sits alongside Device Guard. We've got the the ability to go through and start blocking past the hash attacks. Again, this also uses that virtualization-based security. So it basically uses a subset of Hyper-V to perform some of this protection for us. It protects the LSA service, and it also protects the NTLM hash here. And as I mentioned, it goes through and effectively prevents tools like Mimikatz from actually being able to capture those credentials. So that brings us to the end of today's content. So don't forget that next month we'll be focusing in more detail on how we can actually start putting some of the additional technologies into place to get some really quick wins in a Windows 10 and Windows Server environment. So for resources, let's start off with upcoming events. So up on the Australian partner site, there's a couple of events. One of them, the one at the top, if you are Sydney based and you need to or you are interested in doing the Windows 10 and EMS exam readiness session, contact us on the email address that will be on the next slide. It's OEM Server AU@Microsoft.com, but it's on the next slide, so grab it from there. But alternatively, the next one, the Windows 10 Tech Series, these are 3-day in-depth training on Windows 10 deployment and management. So some of those technologies that we spoke about today, so especially things like Device Guard and Credential Guard, they're pieces that we will cover in a lot more detail during those. So it's probably a little bit late for anyone in Sydney to attend this, but there's a chance that I'm guessing people in Perth might be able to register for this beforehand. Now finally, for the final resource slide before we wrap up, we've got the Microsoft Australia OEM team blog site. So that's the Oz OEM team. I try to at least get a post or two up a week if possible. And if there's more interesting stuff happening, obviously I'll post a lot more. We've got that OEM Server AU@Microsoft.com. So if you are interested in participating in the Windows 10/EMS exam bootcamp preparation event, which gets you a free exam voucher and a free practice exam from MeasureUp, please email this address and just put in Windows 10 exam session. Then finally, Smart HQ. So this is the Australian OEM team site where you can go and get critical information around Windows 10, Office, Server, different Windows 10 devices, and it's geared at partners to make sure that they're getting the latest and greatest information. So that brings us to an end of the recording for this month. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been a short, sharp one, but next month we'll follow on with some of the additional technologies so that you really get a good idea of how we can start really leveraging Windows 10 and Windows Server 2016 together. So thank you for joining us today, and look forward to you joining us again next month.